hour, I do want to introduce our two presenters for this evening. Really very awesome individuals. I have the pleasure to know both of them. So it really is a pleasure to introduce them this evening. First, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Roberta Ridley, who is the chairwoman of the African American Genealogical Society of Fort Wayne. It's under her leadership the society was kind of born and continues to grow. I say this, I hope not to aggravate her in any way, but Roberta knows everybody. So she's a great resource. It's like you can talk particular family name, particular church or whatever. And Roberta really is a great resource. So she's going to give the first part of the presentation this evening. Someone I've known many years, not that either one of us are very old, but Dr. Al Brothers, amazing individual. He's on the executive committee, vice president of the African American Genealogical Society of Fort Wayne. He's the education chair. He teaches at the Midwest African American Genealogical Institute, as does Roberta. Dr. Brothers is an amazing font of information, and he's got an exciting life too. I mean, as an engineer, Air Force, I mean, just amazing. You could talk till midnight on just all the exciting things that he's done. But to kick off our program this evening, I'm going to go ahead and go off camera. I'm going to share the screen because I have Roberta's slide deck ready to go. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Brothers and Roberta, for being here this evening.
So once again, my name is Roberta Ridley, chairwoman of the African American Genealogical Society of Fort Wayne. And Kurt, thank you for that awesome and all but overwhelming introduction. I'm humbled, I truly am. And I hope that I'll be able to share with our listeners, viewers this evening, information that will either answer some questions or lead you to the search to get answers for questions that you may have on your genealogy research and as it relates to Fort Wayne's African American founders. We are part 3, as indicated on the program, and we're into a different segment. That segment that we're looking at right now is 1945 to 1975 or 44. But we're following World War II. And a lot of changes took place all across the country, very drastic and uprooting changes as a result of World War II. And Fort Wayne was really not different than anywhere else in the United States. Here in Fort Wayne, there were changes in terms of African American population. It grew from 2,517 in 1940 to 5,294 in 1950. So we know that that had to have an impact in the residents here, in commercial, education, every facet of living. And by the end of the period of 1960, it was 11,645 residents. And it constituted 7.2% of the city's total population. And we want to know what was happening. How did it actually impact Fort Wayne as a city? What types of changes were experienced by the African American people who came here? And who were the people that affected those changes? And what were the benefits? What were the downfalls? A little bit of all of that. Upon deciding that we were going to talk about the time period in this chunk of years, it really is a lot. And maybe we took on too much to talk about. And I can't help but think that as there's so many things that changed. And since we're talking doubling, almost tripling the number of people, it wasn't just Fort Wayne, but close by cities such as South Bend, Indiana, Gary was affected, Grand Rapids, Michigan, a little further. So though we're talking big numbers. So since we are talking those big numbers and those just big changes, we should probably get started on that. So in January 1946, I want to share with you, there was a cross section of 70 community activists, Black and white, signed a charter with much public support. One of their first initiatives was to co-sponsor an ambitious 3-day conference in late November 1946 to address the hard issues of employment, housing, and education, which we're going to talk about. For what was no doubt the first time in the city's history, a broad cross section of local organizations and civic leaders worked together to bring issues of race before the public. This is an extraction from an article written entitled Pushing the Color Line, Race and Employment in Fort Wayne, Indiana, from the Indiana History magazine. This article was written by Peggy Siegel, that quote that I just shared with you. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about the education situation. The Kern Report of 1949, the school system showed little concern for integration, even though there was 7.7% of elementary schools and 4.1% of high school enrollment. The largest Black enrollment in the elementary grades was in 3 schools. There was Harmer Elementary, there was Hannah, the Harmer with 35.5%, Hannah Elementary at 60%, and Studi at 25.4%. Central High School had 143 students, was the largest Black enrollment at the high school level. Nonetheless, Fort Wayne Community Schools had no teachers. This is something that, a lot of people might think is not relevant, but when you are addressing students, children, it always takes in better when you can identify with someone or someone identifies with you as you are experiencing learning things that you've never learned before, didn't know about. And it was an issue. It was an issue, and it was an issue that had to be dealt with. And as I said, there's so much information to share that I really won't be able to get to all of it, but I want to have you take note of the environment that is in existence at the time. So next we had to look at what took place from this research that they did. And as a result, it was in 1952 that Fort Wayne Community Schools hired their first African-American teacher. And that, my dear folks, is in my lifetime. I don't know about many of you out there, but it was in my lifetime. Gloria Morton Finney of Indianapolis, Indiana, was hired to teach 2nd grade at Hannah's Elementary School here in Fort Wayne. And in 1954, 2 additional Black teachers were hired by the school system. It was Mary Clark Ray. She was 4th grade at Hannah Elementary, and then Pauline Ford, Harmer, 2nd grade. And all of these were assigned to schools having high enrollments of Black students in Black neighborhoods. Such hiring placements of the Black teachers continued throughout the 1950s and the 60s. So let's take a look at who these people really are. They're just names in a history book, but next, if you'll take a look at the nice image of Gloria Morton Finney. As I said, she was hired as Fort Wayne's first African-American teacher in 1952. She was born and reared in Indianapolis, attending Crispus Attucks High School, and she attended Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, and then to Butler University. Both of those schools she went to upon achieving her Bachelor of Science and her Master's of Science degrees. And her graduate studies were completed at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Miss Morton Finney stayed in Fort Wayne, but a few years. She did return back to Indianapolis. I want you to take note that even though there was an intelligent residents of Fort Wayne, African American, the first teacher that they hired actually came from Indianapolis. A hiring pattern that has been discussed many, many times throughout the years as to how it is that local people did not get the jobs and they went outside the Fort Wayne residents to bring in individuals to do these first time jobs quite often. After Gloria Finney, there were 2 additional teachers hired, but it was 1954 before they brought in these 2 additional teachers. And the next view shows that the first person was Evangelist Mary V. Clark Ray. And I'd be remiss if I did not address the fact that this was my 4th grade teacher. And I thought she was just an angel. I thought she was the greatest thing that ever existed as an adult. And I still have a great deal of reverence for her. She was the second Negro African American teacher hired by Fort Wayne Community Schools. in 1954, and she taught until 2004, and she died the following year. She expanded her teaching capabilities beyond the fourth grade, without a doubt, into other areas of teaching in Fort Wayne. Along with Mrs. Clark Ray was Burnham May Shoecraft Adams, and she did not start with Fort Wayne Community Schools until 1962 and taught until 1989. I mentioned I didn't pull in everybody, but I wanted to share with you some of the most influential teachers at the um, grade school level in particular. And these two ladies here were very, very popular with students and parents and in the community as well. And as a matter of fact, I'm pleased to say that I just spoke to Miss Verna Mae Adams 1 week ago, Friday, and she is still driving, and she is still beautiful, and she is still pleasant, and she is still, I have to say, sharing her ability to teach. So these are some of the first teachers at the Fort Wayne Community Schools of African American origin. Mary Ray and of course Gloria Finney, Morton Finney being the first two to come along. Next, we have just a sharing of moving forward with education. I want to say that there are big gaps in hiring African American teachers, and there are lists that are available. We're happy to share that with people if they have that level of curiosity, but I encourage you to step out on your own to look to see when these teachers came. And note in the articles that I referred to, they were not hired all at once. There was a little bit of a gap, and they were hired specifically to teach in the schools that had the highest registration of African American students. And this was a problem after a fashion. It did become something that was addressed by the NAACP chapter here in Fort Wayne, and there were protests pertaining to the schools that would only allow Black teachers in those schools and not the other schools in Fort Wayne. And this went on throughout the years until we have the civil rights movement taking place in the 60s. Again, a lot to cover, so I'm going to try to bullet some things to get your curiosity going. The picture that you're looking at right now, which is also available in the History Center, but online for you that would like to look further, is the 1969 Freedom School in Fort Wayne. And the class is being conducted at the Pilgrim Baptist Church here in Fort Wayne by Miss Catherine Simmons. And for those of you who may not be aware, the Freedom Schools were a direct result of the schools, the parents of the students in the schools of Fort Wayne, African American students, who decided that this segregation in the schools was not fair. It was not appropriate. They were not getting equal education. They were not being allowed to go to the schools that they wanted to go to in order to get a better education. And so there was a walkout from the schools here. And to continue with the education that would be provided for the student, they had freedom schools. And the freedom schools conducted by teachers in the churches primarily. It lasted for approximately 9 days here in Fort Wayne. Other freedom schools existed across the country, and you can look into that at your when you're doing your research as well. So that's to give an idea of the impact of the advancement, where these huge population changes, shifts, and it brought on a lot of tension to the neighborhoods where people were looking to buy homes because they had jobs that they could afford to live in these homes, but they weren't being allowed to do that. And so with education does come employment. So let's take a look at what was going on the next screen there in August of 1963. They did a study of employment here in Fort Wayne. And the study indicates, if you can take your time and scan through here to see the types of professional and technical jobs that were being held by African Americans in Fort Wayne. primarily during that time period, we're still looking at African Americans doing, shall we say, menial work, domestic work, waitresses, maids, cleaning in hotels and businesses of that sort. And you can see that Fort Wayne State School workers, and that was a state school for the mentally disabled, had the highest level of employment for African Americans. And then, of course, next we have the school teachers. Interesting to see if you look at the other professionals of the category of one employee for these specific jobs: school secretary, federal office worker, a court bailiff, councilman, an engineer or office worker, traffic department worker. You can see as you look at this that there were no real numbers of professional jobs being occupied by African Americans here in Fort Wayne. I have to step out on that limb and say that that Fire Prevention Bureau worker was that big brother of mine who became the first African American firefighter hired by Fort Wayne in 1963. So we're talking about education and connected to employment. So we're going to go on to see that if you get an education, it's kind of a progressive thing. You're going to get a job and you're going to want to buy a home. So let's take a look at what happened. When we have education, then we have individuals who are going to try to buy houses and employment. At this particular juncture, we have the civil rights movement beginning to take full swing. This photo that I'm sharing with you today comes from protesters in front of what is the Scottish Rite Auditorium, which is now St. Francis. It's a wing of St. Francis, downtown Fort Wayne. And these individuals representing an organization called Citizens for Equality Through Separation. And the newspaper article from the Journal Gazette actually gave their name and addresses the fact that comments from these individuals as to why they feel so confident that African Americans and Anglo Americans of these United States should not live together in the same neighborhood and should not have the same wages, should not have the same quality of education. And they had no shame whatsoever in letting everybody know about it. And I thought it was, I can't help but wonder, and I know that there are many other people who have seen this picture in the last year or so. What are their thoughts now? Are they still with us? Are they still alive? What did they teach their children? And what do their grandchildren think of these images today? All because people who had worked and served to help build this country wanted to have the same benefits as everyone else. They earned them the same way. And so the protests that these people should not have the houses that they want or the jobs that were necessary in order to support their families. Something to think about and something to follow up. Did this person end up being one of your neighbors or your parents' neighbors? There was a housing study done in 1959. Let's take a look at some of that information. You can, of course, read along with me on that next screen. The 1959, the United States Civil Rights Commission, after a study of conditions in South Bend, Fort Wayne, and Indianapolis, reported the area of discrimination in housing in Indiana is probably the greatest blight we are facing in the problems of discrimination affecting the Civil Rights Commission. The study showed that the percentage of substandard units occupied by non-whites ranged from 50 to 95%, and that the minority groups had a little share in the new housing units. In the South Bend, less than 2% of new housing was available to Blacks, although they made up 9% of the population. And banks refused to extend credit to open occupancy projects. In South Bend, such public housing as had been built were projects that were occupied principally by Blacks. But in Fort Wayne, where new public housing projects were being built, only one of three was to be open to Blacks. One of three of the projects to be open to Blacks. Not that it was for Blacks only, but some percentage of that third unit was going to allow some blacks to live in it. Something to think about. In Indianapolis, Lockfield Gardens, which was operated by the federal government, was exclusively for Negroes. So these figures, these percentages tell us something about what was available and what the struggles still were in order for African Americans to have proper, decent housing here in Fort Wayne. And that even with government projects being implemented to allow for that housing, they still weren't letting African Americans get the full benefit of it. There's so much that we can dig into in order to come up with percentages and the names of the people who did this and who got the houses, how long were they there, if there were other projects, how did they qualify to get in? And if there was a government subsidized housing being built to correct the housing situation here in Fort Wayne, how is it that there were 3 new projects being built and only one of them was allowing African Americans to occupy a home in those project homes? I think that we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. And like I said, this is not enough time to really give specifics, but we are talking about double, triple the African American population in these areas between 1944 and in this particular case, 1960. So what happens after 1960 to 1970 becomes a little bit more vague, as there are other programs that are implemented and the statistics on those become not so black and white. But to give you some idea of Fort Wayne and what has changed and what needs to be worked on. So I'm going to come back to you after Dr. Brothers shares some information that influences, because we have populations that come to Fort Wayne that housing does become a concern. Dr. Brothers.
Thank you, Roberta. Well, again, welcome. I'm Dr. Rob Brothers, and I certainly appreciate you joining us tonight. What I will talk about is really the Fort Wayne military story between 1944 and 1975. As part of our Fort Wayne, Allen County story, the key events that took place in that time period, we talk about the end of World War II, integration of the U.S. military, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. As you look at the Fort Wayne Allen County timeline, again, you see the same thing, but you see something in the middle. The GI Bill of Rights. It gave education rights and housing rights to those who served in the military. And integration of the U.S. military took place in 1947, and was interesting because, again, that change made a major impact based upon the experience of black military service people in World War II. Now, what are the local, state, and national events impacting Fort Wayne and Allen County? Again, we talked about the Voting Rights Act, the 1947 integration, the 1968 flu epidemic, and I was part of that. I had the flu, and my base was almost shut down. Vietnam War protests, obviously school integration, the Kent State situation with the Vietnam protest, and the assassination of the Kennedys and MLK. These all impacted our military people and our civilians as well. Now, the unfolding story. You talk about World War II. Remember, we had rationing, tremendous amount of rationing. And at the end of World War II, the rationing ceased. We had women working in the factories and running households and businesses, and many did not go back to the house. They, in fact, stayed working as well. We had our returning veterans who looked for work. And one of the interesting articles that I found out from the Fort Wayne News Sentinel, that in 29 August 1944, that 11,649 citizens were currently in the armed forces, and that 560 had been discharged by that date. So a total of 12,209 people from Fort Wayne had were serving in World War II. My suspicion at the bottom is that 200 or less African-American men in Fort Wayne were drafted or volunteered, and I'll show you why. First, I want to share with you again, our soldiers, again, primarily we're ground soldiers, again, in the Army and the Marine Corps. But we had a special group of people who obviously were part of the Tuskegee Airmen. And this gentleman was, in fact, a key player. He was a maintenance person. We had 450 pilots who painted the tails of their planes red to earn 1,000 decorations. And they won praise from the white bomber crews they protected. And they destroyed or damaged more than 400 enemy aircraft and sank a German destroyer. But it was people like Latimer who lived here in Fort Wayne who kept them in the air and improved their odds of coming home safely. Having been a military pilot flying both bombers and fighters, I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, because those men and women today were the ones who keep our planes available for flying. Now, as you look at World War II, we mentioned that 12,200 Fort Wayners served during World War II. The Allen County population in 1940 was 155,084. The Black population was 2,553. Now, Fort Wayne itself had 2,517 as part of the Black population. But as I mentioned, the eligible male pool was only 551. That was males between the ages of 21 and 44. So again, out of that pool, how many really served in World War II? As I said, my suspicion is less than 200. And again, our veterans data, unfortunately, only talks about current veterans and not veterans in that time frame. And this is an interesting one, because this was post right at the end of World War II. It was a marriage of Tech Sergeant and Mrs. Emmett Brummel. And again, the bride was from Fort Wayne, and her husband was a tech sergeant with the officers' mess out there at, we will call it Bear Field. So again, this was the start of normalcy. Now on the left is an interesting one, again, from the Indianapolis Star. President Truman said the war has ended and it was over. And the right talks about how most of our men came back, men and women came back on board transport ships. Now, I do want to point out that reporting statistics changed post-World War II. Prior to and including World War II, statistics were relatively easy to discern. And this is for our soldiers, airmen, and Marines. Again, it's readily available, it's out there. But post-World War II and after integration, it became more challenging to get aggregate race data. And in some cases, race was not reported, or all minorities were aggregated together. Age and gender are readily available, but specific race-related statistics were not readily reported outside of the Pentagon. I do want to mention that the Pentagon has all the information. It does exist, but you'll have to get into some special offices in order to get it. As part of the unfolding story, the Korean War took place. And again, Fort Wayne residents in the Korean War, there were 1,619. As you take a look at the Fort Wayne population in 1950, you had 132,729. The Black population in 1950 was 5,140. Now, the eligible male pool was 1,290. So again, out of those 1,619, a small portion were African-American males. As you take a look at the Korean War, it primarily was a ground war, and a vicious ground war, and African-American soldiers, as are shown in this picture, fought in the Korean War. The Korean War is different. World War II actually ended, and we in fact had a peace treaty. An armistice was signed at the end of the Korean War, and we still have no peace treaty today. So again, POWs came back after the end of it. We left some over there, unfortunately, they're MIAs, but this was a very, very different war. Now, the war that I was involved in, Vietnam, which occurred between 1965 and 1975, you had 4,730 Fort Wayne residents in the Vietnam War. The Fort Wayne general population was 225,184, the Fort Wayne black population had grown. Remember, in World War II, you had just over 2,000. In 1970, you have 18,511, and the eligible male population was 2,790. So a larger pool of people were available, and more, in fact, were involved in the Vietnam War itself. A very, very different war. And again, it was when we came back, we were not very well greeted, I might point out, because it was a very unpopular war. And again, showing both sides of the war itself, I was part of the air war. So again, I was in F4 back there, but the largest portion of our people fighting the war were on the ground. And this picture reflects it. The end of the Vietnam War, Saigon surrendered. We ourselves, if many of you remember the history, in fact, pulled out. Again, there had been a number of peace tries, but after 35 years, the war finally ended with the surrender of Saigon. So as you look at that time period of 31 years, Fort Wayne and Allen County, African Americans were involved in military history in that period. Servicemen and women returned to continue their lives post-war. And Fort Wayne and Allen County African Americans were impacted by the key events locally, statewide, countrywide, and worldwide. But we prospered and survived. So again, this is just a quick overview. As you can take a look at the number of available males, of African American males, you can see that not as many as were involved from this city as from others. And I'd like to turn it back over to you, Roberta.
All right. Listening to Dr. Brothers share information about military almost makes you forget that people actually got hurt and were injured. Is so exciting and informative. At least I think so. And so it gives us a different perspective on the country that we live in, and particularly when we hear about the African American participation. So thank you, Dr. Brothers. I'm going to talk about what happens when people get sick. And as I said, we forget sometimes that those soldiers come back with injuries, illnesses, and we have families who have not always had the protection that they needed. So during that period, 1944 to 1975, African American medical attention here in Fort Wayne. You see before you a list of African American doctors who were practicing here in Fort Wayne during those periods. And these are the most known. And I did try to scour the corners of the city and the history to make sure I brought in everyone that I could find. There are a couple of names that may be missing that I have not gotten the background on, and we'll talk about that. But let's start off with Dr. Theodore Borders. Dr. Theodore Borders is a name that should be known by at least my age group and the one that comes behind me. Dr. Borders and his wife were very influential and very active in the community. Aside from him being a medical doctor, his wife was very active in the community for many different that took place to better the station of African Americans in this community. I want to tell you coming out the gate also that just about all of the doctors were military as well. They had served in the military and later on finished up college in order to be doctors, or had completed their licensing as a doctor and then went into the military. So for 30 years, Dr. Borders was a physician here in Fort Wayne. He came and he actually served from 1938, I believe it was, until 1988. So we know that he is written up in the Allen County history book. There's a very good story. So if you have that book and you don't have it, or you don't have it, please stop in at the library, read a little bit more about him and his practice and his contributions here in Fort Wayne. We got several to talk about, so I'm going to move through them rather quickly. He was a member of Turner Chapel AME Church here in Fort Wayne, Board of Trustees with the Frontiers Club and the Elks Hermetic Lodge, and he was a captain in the Army Reserve during World War I. And he is buried in Omaha, Nebraska. That's Dr. Borders. And I do believe he, being the first doctor, he served and was very, uh, he didn't have hospital privileges. That's something that I thought was kind of strange. A lot of people don't know about that, that because you were a doctor during that time period, that it doesn't mean that you could have a patient admitted into the hospital and care for that patient in the hospital, which I would imagine would be the reason that many African Americans did not want to go to the hospital. Beside Dr. Borders here, you have an image of Dr. Roland Wilson, very, very popular. Let's go back to that one. Dr. Wilson was born in Delaware, Newark, Delaware, as you can see on the image there. It's not a very good one, but I couldn't find a lot of pictures about him. Dr. Dr. Wilson was not to be held back. Let's just put it that way. He practiced medicine for 45 years, as you could see in the write up there. He was a U.S. Army veteran also. He received a patent in 1985 for his invention of an ice block making and storage system. And he was the first African American doctor on staff at a Fort Wayne hospital. He was very instrumental and very active in all civil rights programs, education, supporting other people seeking education, and to provide service for those that could not afford it as well. So Dr. Wilson, he died in, as you can see, 1996. Next one, please. Dr. Robert Stanton. He has a very interesting career aside from being a medical doctor. He was elected to the Indiana House in 1932 and served 2 terms representing Lake County. He was one of the first Blacks elected to the Indiana legislature. Being involved in politics and then being involved in medicine, the man had a full plate, and he actually worked 50 years before retiring. And this was a gentleman that I knew as a child, and the family. The family was very active in the community, and they were involved in all aspects of trying to move African American education and community services. And his daughter, I was lucky enough to speak with about the history of her father here in Fort Wayne and affiliation with other doctors in the community. And we know that he was very busy with the Urban League and a trustee at the Turner Chapel AME Church. Please note, so far, these doctors have attended Turner Chapel AME Church, the oldest African American church in the city, and also very, very functional. So Beverly, if you're out there, let's stay in touch, because I know there's a whole lot more that we can share about Dr. Stanton and his involvement, particularly when it comes down to him being in the Indiana House. With Dr. Stanton, you see in that image is Dr. Bernard Stewart. Dr. Stewart, kind of how we'll say that he is someone that most people in that age group would know a little bit more about. He was also very active in the community. Dr. Stewart was a dentist, and Dr. Stewart actually, and did I mention that Dr. Stanton was a dentist also? Forgive me. He was a dentist as well. And Dr. Stewart was a dentist who comes along a little bit later on with his practice. And he was very involved in the civil rights movement. He is, we want to talk about these individuals because they are trailblazers as far as African Americans in the community and what they have to offer. He attended the Indiana University School of Dentistry. Came back to Fort Wayne. He became president of the local chapter of the NAACP in his early years, and he was very outspoken on the injustices of segregation. So again, showing a community commitment as well as a medical commitment for individuals that's needing to have that type of attention. And we got to remember the doctors and dentists go together, because if you don't take care of your mouth, something is going to happen to your insides, which is going to require a doctor. So having them together. Next, we have Dr. James Grant, another very, you'll excuse me, I messed up on that one. Dr. Marshall, I'm sorry, Dr. Marshall. I did not get a picture of Dr. Marshall, and I'm sorry to say that, but he was a very handsome man. Take my word for it. And he also was very involved, and he came into the picture, if I'm not mistaken. We have Dr. Borders, and then we have Dr. Wilson, and then Dr. Marshall. And as a matter of fact, I believe it was Dr. Marshall that took on Dr. Wilson's practice when he was going into the military. And again, noting that these gentlemen all served in the military. They're also, I want to make the note here, these gentlemen are also affiliated with fraternities. This particular Dr. Marshall is a Omega Phi Psi, a fraternity, and he was Elks Hermetic Lodge 421, and he was also president of the Get Well Baby Clinic and a former member of the Urban League and charter member of the Fort Wayne Frontiers International. Community, community, community involvement. So Dr. Marshall was also, he also had a lot of involvement in helping people get jobs as such. He came to us by way of New York. Now, Dr. Pearson, Dr. Huey Pearson, he is also, and I mention all these doctors because these are doctors who were entrenched in the community. There's hardly anybody in, the 60s to 2000 that doesn't know of these doctors or wasn't attended to by these doctors, somebody in their family that was. So Dr. Huey Pearson, he had a practice here in Fort Wayne. He also was a World War II veteran, and he actually came to us by way of Georgia. And I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of details here, but these are gentlemen, their obituaries are available online through the Allen County Public Library's African American memorials that is coordinated and set up by, oh my gosh, am I going to miss it? Kurt, what's her name? Marcia Smiley. I'm sorry, the Marcia Smiley collection.
Yes.
Please forgive
yes.
me, Marcia, if you're listening. Please forgive me. And so you might want to take a look at these if you want to know more about it. There's a lot of detail that talks about education as well as their community involvement. Beside him, you see Dr. James Grant, another one. Heavy hitters in terms of community and support for education, did a lot for people in the community who had nothing, that weren't able to afford being treated by a doctor or being able to go to the hospital to receive. And they're involved in many of the community organizations that are important to the community as well. Of course, they are involved in the medical associations and the National Medical Society. And this particular Dr. Marshall, he was Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. And I'm bringing that up because recently we've done some research on the history of fraternal organizations and how they come back within the African American community to help the community as a whole. So there we have Dr. James Graham. The next one that we look at here is going back a little ways as well, but not quite as far. I mentioned that there was Dr. Roland Wilson. Well, he had a brother, and that was Alan. So Roland Wilson did the medical, and Alan did the dentistry. And he also is a military background. So you want to take a look at his information there. You can blow it up and see what's going on with him. He served in Germany, and he was with the U.S. Medical Corps there. He's a native, as I said, of his brother, Newark, Delaware. So next one that we're going to have a look at. After all of the war and the medical treatments, things don't always end well. And so I thought it would be a nice way to close out to let you know that the longest running mortuary in the community was Mashaw Funeral Home, that was opened and orchestrated by Ellis Mashaw, who ran that funeral home for more than 60 years. And he, of course, died in 1952, but his wife, Josie Lee Bryant Mashaw, continued the business until 2002. So during this time period that we're looking at, he was the primary African American mortician in our community. And there's a lot of history there as well. Hopefully, one day we'll get those records to share with everyone. So that concludes the medical side of it. I would have liked to have talked about diseases and things that were prevalent during the time period, but I think Dr. Brothers kind of touched on, things with the flu epidemic, and there are always the injuries that soldiers incur, and that's another presentation, and we'll probably do that